The diner was full. 40 people heard every word. A manager's voice carried across the floor with the precision of someone who knew exactly what a public audience did to a person's dignity, and used it. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The coffee cups sat still. And then, from the back corner booth, a man in a black leather vest with a death's head patch stood up, slowly, completely, and began to walk toward the counter. 300 pounds of silence moving through a room that had just remembered it was watching something it should have stopped. The thing about Rosie's diner was that it smelled like hope and exhaustion in equal measure. That was how Chloe Bennett had described it to her mother once, on the phone, during a break between the lunch and dinner rushes, standing in the narrow alley behind the kitchen where the dishwashers smoked and the grease trap hummed. Her mother had laughed and said that sounded about right for any place that served coffee at all hours and asked nothing of you except that you sit down and order something. Chloe had laughed too, and then she had gone back inside and refilled 14 coffee cups in 8 minutes and smiled at every single person she refilled them for, because that was what the job required, and she was good at the job, and being good at something, even something that left your feet aching and your uniform smelling of bacon grease by 9 in the morning, was not nothing. Rosie's occupied a low brick building on Union Avenue in Bakersfield, California, wedged between a check-cashing place and a tire shop, with a red neon sign in the window that had been missing the apostrophe in Rosie's for 3 years and that nobody had gotten around to fixing. Inside, it was exactly what it appeared to be from the outside. 12 booths upholstered in red vinyl that had cracked and been repaired with electrical tape. A counter with 8 stools, a jukebox in the corner that still worked if you hit it on the left side with the flat of your hand, and walls decorated with framed photographs of Bakersfield in the 1950s and 60s, when the oil industry had made it briefly prosperous and the country music scene had made it briefly famous. The kitchen was small and loud and ran on the controlled chaos of 2 cooks, Bobby and Terence, who communicated almost entirely through a private language of gestures and abbreviated curse words that Chloe had spent 6 months learning to interpret. She had been working at Rosie's for 2 years and 4 months. She had taken the job 3 weeks after moving to Bakersfield from Fresno, following the collapse of a relationship she didn't talk about much, and the parallel collapse of a receptionist position at a dental office that had closed abruptly when the dentist relocated to Arizona without adequate notice to his staff. She had arrived in Bakersfield with $1,100, a car that needed new brake pads, and the particular determination of someone who had decided, quietly and without drama, that self-pity was a luxury she couldn't afford. The job at Rosie's had been advertised on a card in the window. She had walked in, spoken to Frank Delgado, the owner, a broad, affable man in his late 50s, who ran the place with genuine warmth and genuine disorganization in roughly equal proportions, and been hired on the spot because, as Frank had put it, she had an honest face and she didn't look like she'd dropped the coffee pot. She had not dropped the coffee pot in 2 years and 4 months, which she considered one of her more reliable achievements. Frank Delgado was currently in Phoenix, visiting his daughter and her newborn son. He had been gone for 11 days and was due back in 4. In his absence, the operational management of Rosie's had fallen to Dennis Pruitt. This was the part of the arrangement that Chloe would have described, if asked to be completely honest, as the single largest source of difficulty in her otherwise manageable life. Dennis Pruitt had been the assistant manager at Rosie's for 14 months. He was 44 years old, medium height, with the particular physical quality of a man who had been athletic in his 20s and had since allowed that athleticism to curdle into something that was neither fit nor soft, but simply dense, like material that had been compressed under pressure. He had thin brown hair combed flat, small eyes the color of old dishwater, and a mouth that defaulted to a slight downward curve that gave his face the permanent expression of someone who had just been told something mildly disappointing. He wore his authority the way some men wore ill-fitting clothes, with a kind of aggressive insistence that compensated for the poor fit. Under Frank's management, Dennis was adequate. He processed orders, handled the books, dealt with vendor calls, and generally performed the administrative functions of his role without distinction or failure. What he could not do, under Frank's watchful presence, was indulge the particular quality that Chloe had identified in him within her first month at Rosie's. Dennis Pruitt was a man who needed, at regular intervals, to remind himself that he had power over someone. Frank's absence had removed the only check on this tendency that the diner's ecosystem provided. The morning of the day that everything changed was a Thursday in mid-November, and Bakersfield was doing the thing it did in November, producing a grey, flat sky that sat low over the valley like a lid, filtering the light into something wan and directionless that made every surface look slightly more tired than it actually was. The temperature was 53 degrees, which in Bakersfield constituted genuine cold, and the diner was running at near capacity by 7:30 because people had decided the grey morning warranted hot food and company. Chloe had been on since 6. She had served 41 customers, refilled coffee approximately 90 times, managed a complaint about undercooked eggs from the man in booth 7 with the patience of a saint, and was currently navigating the controlled chaos of the morning rush with Sandra Morse, her closest friend at Rosie's, who worked the counter while Chloe worked the floor. Sandra was 26, 3 years older than Chloe in age, and approximately a decade older in the particular wisdom that came from having worked the service industry since she was 16. She had red hair that she kept in a braid, and a laugh that was too large for the space it inhabited, and she was the person Chloe called when anything went wrong, which made her, in practical terms, the most important person in Chloe's life in Bakersfield. "Table 4 needs a refill," Sandra said in passing, carrying 3 plates with the practiced balance of someone for whom this motion was as natural as breathing. "On it," Chloe said. She grabbed the coffee carafe and turned toward table 4, and that was when she clipped the edge of the service station with her hip. A collision she had made approximately once a week for 2 years, because the service station was positioned 6 inches too close to the main floor path and had always been, and Frank had always meant to have it moved and never had. The carafe didn't fall. She caught it, adjusted her grip, and continued toward table 4 without breaking stride. What she hadn't accounted for was that Dennis Pruitt was standing at the end of the counter, watching. "Bennett." She turned. His voice had that quality it got when he had decided something was going to be an event. "You almost dropped that," he said. "I didn't drop it," she said, keeping her voice even. "I saw you stumble." "I clipped the service station. I've got the carafe." Dennis looked at her with those dishwater eyes, and then did something she had seen him do before, but that never failed to land with the particular impact of something designed to land. He raised his voice. Not shouted, just elevated it, precisely enough to carry across the diner floor, precisely enough to ensure that the people in the nearest booths could hear every word without it being technically a scene. "This is the 3rd time this week you've been careless on the floor," he said. "I've been watching you all morning, and frankly your performance has been sloppy. You're slow on the refills. You argued with the customer in booth 7 instead of simply fixing the problem. And now you're stumbling around the floor with a full carafe of hot coffee. You want to tell me what's going on with you, or do I have to write this up?" The diner did not go silent. It went quieter. The particular quieter of a space in which people are pretending to continue their conversations while actually listening. Chloe was aware of it, the way you were aware of a temperature change. Suddenly and all at once, the air in the room shifting into something different, She stood very still. The carafe was in her hand. The coffee in it was hot enough to burn, and she was acutely aware of this in a way that had nothing to do with any intention, and everything to do with the specific helplessness of holding something dangerous when someone was trying to make you feel small. She was 24 years old. She had driven 4 hours from Fresno with $1,100 and rebuilt something out of very little. She had not dropped a coffee pot in 2 years and 4 months. She had handled the eggs complaint in booth 7 with patience and competence, and had comped the customer's meal out of her own tips, because that was what the situation required, and she had done it without being asked. She was aware that her face was flushing. She was aware that Ruth Calloway in booth 3, a 67-year-old retired schoolteacher who came in every Thursday morning for oatmeal and the newspaper, had looked up from her reading glasses with an expression of unmistakable discomfort. She was aware that Bobby had gone still in the kitchen window, holding a plate. She took a breath. "I'll be more careful," she said. Her voice was level. It cost her something to make it level. Dennis held her gaze for a moment longer than necessary, the specific extra beat of a man, savoring a dynamic he had created, and then turned back to the counter. Chloe went to table 4 and refilled the coffee. Her hands were steady. She smiled at the man in the booth, who looked at her with the slight discomfort of someone who had witnessed something he wished he hadn't and didn't know what to do with the knowledge. She went back to the service station. Sandra appeared beside her for exactly 4 seconds, long enough to put a hand briefly on her arm and say, very quietly, "He's a small man, doing small things," and then was gone again, back to the counter. Chloe nodded. She picked up the next order. She kept moving. What she didn't know yet was that in booth 9, in the back corner of the diner where the light was dimmest and the vinyl was most repaired, a man named Caleb Brooks had set down his coffee cup and was looking at Dennis Pruitt with an expression that could not be read from a distance, but that, up close, would have communicated something very specific to anyone paying attention. Caleb Brooks had been coming to Rosie's diner for 6 years. He came on Thursday mornings, almost without exception, between 7:30 and 9. He always took booth 9, the back corner, the one with sightlines to both the entrance and the kitchen, the one where your back was to the wall. He always ordered the same thing: 2 eggs over easy, wheat toast, black coffee, and a side of the house hot sauce that Bobby made from a recipe he claimed came from his grandmother in Louisiana, and that was, by general consensus, the best thing on the menu that wasn't technically on the menu. He tipped 40%, always in cash, always left flat on the table rather than handed to the server, with the particular discretion of someone who understood that gratitude was more dignified when it didn't require acknowledgement. He was 52 years old and built like something that had been constructed for a specific and demanding purpose, broad through the chest and shoulders, with forearms that suggested decades of physical work, and the kind of physical stillness that wasn't inertia but its opposite, the stillness of something that had learned to conserve its energy for when energy was genuinely required. His hair was steel grey, cropped close on the sides, slightly longer on top. His beard was full and the same steel grey, kept neat. His hands were large and showed their history, knuckles that had been broken and healed, a scar along the right index finger, the particular roughness of skin that had spent decades exposed to sun and wind and work. He wore, on this Thursday morning as on most Thursday mornings, dark jeans, a plain grey Henley, and the black leather vest that was the most significant garment in his wardrobe in ways that had nothing to do with aesthetics. The vest had patches on it, the most prominent, arched across the top in bold red letters on a white background, read, "Hell's Angels." Below it, in a bottom rocker, the word, "Bakersfield." On the left breast, the Death's Head logo that was one of the most recognized and most misunderstood, Caleb had always privately thought, symbols in American motorcycle culture. Caleb Brooks had been the president of the Bakersfield chapter of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club for 9 years. Before that, he had been a member for 14 years. Before that, he had been a machinist at a manufacturing plant in East Bakersfield, a husband briefly to a woman named Patricia, who had left when the club became more central to his life than she was comfortable with, and the father of a daughter named Grace, who was now 27 and lived in Sacramento, and called him every Sunday without fail, which he considered the single greatest ongoing achievement of his life. The public understanding of the Hells Angels was, in Caleb's experience, composed in roughly equal parts of fact, mythology, journalism of varying quality, and the projected anxieties of people who had never spoken to a member. There were things about the club's history that he did not defend and would not defend. There were chapters and individuals and incidents that belonged to a category he had long since decided was not his to explain or excuse. What he could speak to was what he knew, which was the chapter he ran, the men in it, and the particular code, unwritten, unspoken as a formal document, but as real and binding as anything he had ever encountered, that governed how they moved through the world. The code was not complicated. It came down, in its essence, to a small number of things: loyalty to the people you claimed, honesty about who you were, and the understanding that respect was the only currency that actually held its value over time. There was a corollary to this last point that Caleb had arrived at over years of observation rather than instruction. The men who most loudly demanded respect were almost always the men who least understood what it was. He had been watching Dennis Pruitt for the better part of 6 Thursday mornings. He came to Rosie's because the food was good and because Frank Delgado had, years ago, extended a specific courtesy to Caleb and his members, had never asked them to leave, had never treated their presence as a problem to be managed, had simply served them coffee and eggs and treated them like anyone else, which was rarer than it should have been and which Caleb had never forgotten. He came to booth 9 because it was his booth and had been his booth for 6 years, and the servers knew it and held it for him when they could. Chloe had been his server for the last 1.5 years. She was good at the job in the way that people were good at things they had decided to take seriously, attentive without being obsequious, efficient without being impersonal, possessed of the particular quality of making you feel when she came to your table that she was actually there and not running through her next 12 tasks in her head. She had once, during a complicated morning 6 months ago, when Caleb had come in carrying something heavy that he hadn't intended to be visible, simply refilled his coffee and said, without preamble or excessive warmth, "Bad morning?" And he had said yes, and she had said, "I'm sorry," and had gone back to her work, and the exchange had been exactly as long as it needed to be, and not a word longer, which he had appreciated more than he could easily explain. He had noticed Dennis Pruitt the way he noticed most things, gradually through accumulated observation, building a picture from details before forming a conclusion. He had noticed the way Pruitt's posture changed when Frank was in the building versus when Frank was absent. He had noticed the way Pruitt's voice shifted in register when he spoke to the kitchen staff versus when he spoke to customers. He had noticed specifically the way Pruitt looked at Chloe, not with anything as overt as malice, but with the particular attention of someone who had identified a target for a recurring need. He had seen it before. He had seen it in many contexts and in many forms. The need some men had to diminish others in order to feel adequate to themselves. The specific cowardice of choosing targets who couldn't fight back without losing something, their job, their composure, their dignity in front of an audience. On this Thursday morning, watching Dennis Pruitt elevate his voice across a diner floor to dress down a young woman in front of 40 people for the crime of nearly dropping a carafe she hadn't dropped, Caleb Brooks set down his coffee cup with a care that was almost gentle. Victor Hale was in the booth across from him. Victor was 48, lean and weathered, with 20 years in the club and the particular quality of a man who had learned to read Caleb's stillness the way a sailor reads weather. He looked at Caleb across the table and said nothing. He simply waited. Caleb watched Chloe walk to table 4. He watched her refill the coffee with steady hands. He watched her smile at the customer in the booth. He watched the flush on the back of her neck that she was working very hard to control. He looked at Dennis Pruitt, who had turned back to the counter with the settled satisfaction of a man who had accomplished something. Caleb picked up the last piece of his wheat toast. He ate it slowly. He drank the remainder of his coffee. He did these things with complete unhurriedness, because what came next did not require urgency, and urgency would have changed its meaning. Then he stood up. Victor Hale stood up at the same moment without being asked. Caleb walked from booth 9 to the counter. He walked at his normal pace, which was unhurried, and took up exactly the space it needed to take up. The diner had been doing that quieter-than-quiet thing since Pruitt's public dressing down of Chloe, and Caleb's movement from the back booth toward the counter produced a further shift in the room's atmosphere. The particular shift that happened when people registered, on some pre-conscious level, that something was about to occur that they should pay attention to. Dennis Pruitt was looking at his phone behind the counter. He registered Caleb's approach and looked up with the automatic customer service attention of someone running a register. And then he processed what he was looking at, and something changed in his face. A slight tightening, a recalibration, the face of a man adjusting his self-presentation for an unexpected audience. Caleb stopped at the counter. He placed both hands flat on the surface, which brought him to his full height in a way that was not threatening, but was completely, quietly declarative. He looked at Dennis Pruitt for a long moment without speaking. The diner was, by this point, genuinely silent. There was a specific quality to the silence in Rose's diner at that moment that several of the people present would later attempt to describe to friends, family members, and in at least 2 cases on social media with varying degrees of success. Ruth Calloway, in booth 3, would say it was like the moment before a storm when the air pressure shifts and the birds stop, and you understand without being told that the atmosphere itself has decided something. Bobby, watching from the kitchen window with a spatula in his hand, would describe it more simply. It was the kind of quiet, he would say, that you felt in your chest. Sandra Morse, who had positioned herself at the far end of the counter with the practiced awareness of someone who had spent a decade reading rooms, would say later that she knew from the moment Caleb stood up exactly what was happening, and that she had felt something in her she could only describe as relief, the relief of realizing that someone else had also been watching. Chloe Bennett, standing at the service station with her back half-turned, did not immediately understand what was happening. She had heard the shift in the room's ambient sound, the way conversations tapered, the way the clink of cutlery paused, and she had turned to look, which was how she saw Caleb Brooks standing at the counter with his hands flat on the surface and his eyes on Dennis Pruitt, and Dennis Pruitt looking back at him with the particular expression of a man who was trying to decide how to position himself and finding no good options. She had served Caleb Brooks for 1.5 years. She knew what he was, not in the way of someone who had researched it, but in the practical way of someone who had seen the vest every Thursday morning and understood what the patches meant. Bakersfield was not a city that required education on this subject. The Hells Angels chapter here was visible, known, and regarded with the complex mixture of wariness and grudging respect that had been built over decades of coexistence with a community that had learned to take the measure of things rather than respond purely to reputation. What she knew about Caleb Brooks specifically was this: he was quiet. He was polite in the exact way that people were polite when courtesy was a choice they had made rather than a social reflex, deliberately, with awareness. He tipped generously. He said thank you in a way that meant it, and he had, in a year and a half of Thursday mornings, never once given her a single reason for discomfort. She watched him stand at the counter and did not move. "Mr. Pruitt," Caleb said. His voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. It had the particular carrying quality of voices that were accustomed to being listened to, not because they demanded it, but because something in their register communicated that what they were saying was worth hearing. Dennis Pruitt straightened slightly behind the counter. He was doing the calculation that people did when confronted with Caleb Brooks, the rapid, involuntary assessment of size and implication. And he was arriving, Chloe could see from across the room, at the conclusion that there was no comfortable posture available to him. Standing tall felt like a challenge he couldn't back up. Stepping back felt like retreat. He settled on a kind of rigid neutrality that satisfied neither impulse. "What can I do for you?" Dennis said. His voice was professionally even. Caleb did not answer immediately. He let the question sit for a moment, not in a way that felt theatrical, but in the way of someone who was not going to be rushed by social discomfort into speaking before he was ready. "I've been coming to this diner for 6 years, he said. "Frank Delgado runs a good place. I've always thought so." He paused. "I've been sitting in that booth for the last 2 hours, watching you speak to your staff." Dennis's jaw tightened slightly. "Staff management is—" "I wasn't finished," Caleb said. Not loudly, not aggressively, with the simple clarity of someone stating a fact. Dennis closed his mouth. "That young woman," Caleb said, and he did not gesture toward Chloe, but the room understood who he meant. "Did her job this morning. I watched her do it. She handled a difficult customer with patience. She managed this floor through a rush that would have overwhelmed a less competent person. She didn't drop the carafe." He paused. "What she did do, apparently, was give you an audience, and you used it." The room was so quiet that the refrigeration unit in the back kitchen was audible. "I don't know what you think you accomplished just now," Caleb continued, "but I'll tell you what I saw. I saw a man with a little authority and a lot of need use a public room to make someone smaller than him feel smaller than that. I've seen that before. It doesn't look like management. It looks like something else." Dennis Pruitt's face had gone through several colors during this speech and had arrived at a mottled combination of red and white that communicated the particular physiological distress of a man simultaneously enraged and unable to act on the rage. His hands, flat on the counter, were pressing down hard enough that his knuckles had whitened. "This is a private business matter," he said. His voice had lost its professional evenness and was working hard to retrieve it. "I appreciate your concern, but—" "I'm not expressing concern," Caleb said. "I'm telling you what I observed. And I'm telling you, as someone who has spent 6 years in this diner and who has considerable respect for the person who actually owns it, that what I observed this morning is not something I'm going to sit in that booth and pretend I didn't see." He straightened. He took his hands off the counter. "Frank Delgado gets back in 4 days, he said. "I expect he'll be interested in how things ran while he was gone." He held Dennis Pruitt's gaze for exactly 3 more seconds. Then he turned and walked back toward booth 9 with the same unhurried deliberateness with which he had come. The room exhaled. It happened in stages. First one conversation resumed, then another, then the clink of cutlery returned, then Bobby's voice from the kitchen calling an order number, and then the diner was itself again, the normal ambient hum of a busy Thursday morning, except that the air in it was different in a way that everyone present could feel, and that was difficult to articulate, but that had to do, essentially, with the rebalancing of something that had been knocked out of alignment. Chloe stood at the service station and did not move for a moment that was probably 5 seconds and felt considerably longer. She was aware that her hands, which had been steady through everything that came before, were not entirely steady now. She pressed them flat against the edge of the station and breathed once, carefully. Then she picked up her order pad and walked toward booth 9. Caleb was sitting with his coffee cup, which was nearly empty. Victor Hale was across from him, looking at his phone with the studied casualness of a man demonstrating that he was not monitoring the situation. Chloe refilled Caleb's coffee. Her hand was steady enough. She poured carefully, set the carafe down, and looked at him. "Thank you," she said. She said it quietly, and she meant it without embellishment. Caleb looked up at her. His expression was not warm exactly. It was something more considered than warmth, something that had to do with seeing and acknowledging what was seen. "You do a good job," he said. "That's worth saying out loud." She nodded once. She took the carafe and went back to the floor. Dennis Pruitt spent the remainder of the morning behind the counter and did not speak to Chloe Bennett at all. The lunch rush came in at 11:30 and hit full force by 12:15, which meant that the events of the morning were absorbed into the forward motion of the day the way most things in service work were absorbed. Not forgotten, but filed, stored in the category of things that would be processed later when the immediate demands of the present allowed for it. Chloe worked the floor through the lunch rush with Sandra on the counter and a temporary hire named Kevin covering the back booths. The diner was loud and warm and demanding, and she was grateful for this, grateful for the specific mercy of work that didn't leave room for the things you needed to not think about for a while. Caleb Brooks and Victor Hale left at 9:40. He had left his usual 40% in cash, flat on the table. He had not said anything further to her or to Dennis Pruitt. He had simply paid and left, which was in its own way the most complete possible statement of what the morning had been. He had said what needed saying, and he was not interested in extending the drama. It was Sandra who debriefed her properly, during the 15-minute overlap between the end of Sandra's shift and the beginning of the slower mid-afternoon period, when they stood in the alley behind the kitchen with cups of coffee and the particular relief of people who had earned a pause. "You know what that was?" Sandra said. "I know what it looked like," Chloe said. "What it looked like is what it was. A man who could have ignored it decided not to." Chloe turned her coffee cup in her hands. The alley smelled of grease and cold air and the distant particular smell of the rail yards 2 blocks east. "Dennis is going to be worse now," she said. It wasn't pessimism. It was the practical assessment of someone who understood how men like Dennis Pruitt processed public humiliation. "For 4 days," Sandra said, "and then Frank comes back. Frank doesn't always... Frank is going to hear about this from approximately 6 different people before he walks through the door," Sandra said, with the flat certainty of someone who had watched small communities operate long enough to know their dynamics. "Ruth Calloway is going to tell him. Bobby is going to tell him. And if Caleb Brooks decides to have a word with Frank, which based on what he said this morning seems pretty likely, that's a conversation Dennis Pruitt does not come out of well." Chloe was quiet for a moment. She looked at the grey sky over the alley. "Do you know him?" "Caleb. I know of him. Same as everybody in Bakersfield." Sandra held her coffee cup with both hands. "My uncle knew him, years back. Said he was the straightest dealer he'd ever met. Said if Caleb Brooks told you something, it was true, and if he said he'd do something, it was done. He comes in every Thursday," Chloe said, "for 6 years. I know. I knew who he was. I just never thought about it beyond serving him eggs and refilling his coffee." "Yes." Sandra looked at her. "You want to know what I think? I think he's been paying attention longer than this morning. I think some people watch things without making it obvious, and when something crosses a line they've decided matters, they say so. That's not nothing." Chloe finished her coffee. She set the cup on the ledge by the kitchen door. "No," she said, "it's not nothing." She went back inside. Dennis Pruitt was in the office for most of the afternoon, which was either strategic or coincidental, and which Chloe decided not to assign significance to either way. She worked her section, managed the mid-afternoon lull with the quiet efficiency it required, and was restocking the service station at 3:15 when Ruth Calloway stopped on her way out and put a hand briefly on her arm. Ruth was 67, a retired 8th grade English teacher with white hair cut short and the particular directness of someone who had spent decades communicating clearly with 13-year-olds and had never fully switched that register off. "I've been coming here for 11 years, Ruth said. "I want you to know that what happened this morning was not acceptable and that you handled it with more grace than most people would have." Chloe looked at her. "Thank you, Mrs. Calloway." "And that man—" Ruth glanced toward the back of the diner, though Caleb was long gone. "Whatever else people say about those men and their club, he did the right thing today. Which is more than can be said for the rest of us who sat there and said nothing." She paused. "That's something I'm going to think about." She patted Chloe's arm once, precisely, and went out. Chloe stood at the service station for a moment after the door closed. The jukebox in the corner was playing something slow and country. Merle Haggard, she thought, though she was never quite sure, just knew that it was the particular key of Bakersfield that lived in the walls of this building, and that she had, in 2 years and 4 months, developed an unexpected affection for. She thought about what Ruth had said. More grace than most people would have. She thought about the flush on the back of her neck that she had worked to control. She thought about the carafe in her hand and the specific effort it had taken to keep it steady. She thought about all the things she had not said, could not say without consequence, while Dennis Pruitt's voice carried across the diner floor with the deliberate precision of someone who understood exactly what public audiences did to private dignities. She thought about a man in a Hell's Angels vest standing up from booth 9 because he had decided that what he had seen was not something he was willing to pretend he hadn't seen. That was a choice, she thought, in a room full of people who had all made the same different choice, to look away, to let it pass, to assign it to the category of someone else's problem. One person had made a different one, not because he was required to. Not because it was his job or his business or his responsibility in any formal sense, because he had decided that some things, when you were in the room where they happened, became your responsibility by virtue of your presence. She wasn't sure she had a word for what that was, exactly. She filed it away to think about later, the way you filed things that were too large to process in the middle of a shift. She picked up her order pad. Table 6 needed refilling. Meanwhile, in the office at the back of the diner, Dennis Pruitt sat at Frank Delgado's desk with the particular tight-shouldered stillness of a man replaying a morning and finding no comfortable angle from which to view it. He had been in this industry for 14 years. He had managed staff in 3 different establishments. He was not accustomed to being corrected, publicly, quietly, irrefutably, by a customer. The irrefutability was the part that stayed with him. Pruitt had spent the better part of 6 hours looking for the place where he could push back, where he could construct the version of events that made him right, and he could not find it. The man had not threatened him, had not raised his voice, had not said anything that was technically out of line. He had simply described with complete accuracy and in front of a room full of witnesses what Dennis Pruitt had done, and the description had been so precise and so plainly true that there was no reframing available. He thought about what Caleb had said. Frank Delgado gets back in 4 days. Dennis Pruitt made a decision that afternoon, sitting at Frank's desk with the cold coffee and the sound of the diner operating perfectly well without his supervision. It was not a dramatic decision, and it did not arrive with any particular clarity or self-knowledge. It arrived the way most decisions of its kind arrived, as the path of least resistance, the choice that required the least from a man who had, in the space of one morning, discovered that the room he had thought was his to control was considerably less his than he had believed. He decided he would be careful. He did not decide to be different, but careful was something. Frank Delgado came back on a Monday. He came through the front door at 7:15 in the morning, earlier than expected, carrying a Phoenix Suns cap that his son-in-law had given him, and a phone full of photographs of his new grandson that he showed to Bobby and Sandra and Chloe in sequence, with the uncontainable enthusiasm of a recently minted grandfather. He was 61 days from his 69th birthday, and looked 10 years younger than that on a good morning, which this appeared to be. By 9 o'clock, he had spoken with Bobby. By 9:30, with Sandra. By 10, Ruth Calloway came in for her Thursday oatmeal. It was a Monday, which was unusual, and which communicated to anyone paying attention that she had planned this specifically, and sat with Frank for 20 minutes over coffee. Chloe watched all of this from the floor with the professional awareness of someone who had learned to read the social weather of a room. And what she read was a man being given information and processing it in real time, with the particular stillness of someone who already suspected what he was hearing. Frank found her at 11, during a brief lull between the breakfast stragglers and the early lunch arrivals. He came to the service station, which was an unusual thing for Frank to do. He was an office and counter man, not a floor man, and stood across from her with his hands in the pockets of his jeans and the particular expression of someone who was going to say something they had thought carefully about. "I heard about Thursday," he said. Chloe looked at him. "I figured you would. I'm sorry I wasn't here." "Frank, you didn't—" "I should have thought more carefully about who I left in charge." He said it simply, without excessive self-flagellation, but without excuse either, in the direct way of someone who had spent decades owning his decisions. "That's on me." Chloe was quiet for a moment. "He's been like that for a while," she said. "Not always that visible, but it's been there." Frank nodded slowly. Sandra said the same thing. Bobby said the same thing. He looked at the floor for a moment, then back at her. "I also heard about Caleb." The name settled between them. "He didn't have to do that," Chloe said. "No," Frank agreed, "he didn't." He paused. "Caleb Brooks is not a simple man, and his world is not a simple world. I'm not going to pretend otherwise, but I've known him for 6 years, and the one thing I've always known about him is that he has a very clear idea of what's right and what isn't. And when he sees the line crossed, he says so." Frank looked at her with the directness of someone who had arrived at a point. "I'm grateful he was here." Chloe thought about that. "So am I," she said. Dennis Pruitt resigned 11 days later. He submitted the resignation in writing to Frank, citing personal reasons, and Frank accepted it without pushing for elaboration, which was either mercy or efficiency or some combination of the two. The letter was brief and said nothing that was not true, and nothing that was the actual truth, which was about what anyone expected from a letter of that kind. Frank promoted Sandra to assistant manager, which was a decision that provoked, among the staff of Rosie's Diner, the particular unanimous approval that occurred so rarely in workplace situations that its occurrence was itself worth noting. Sandra accepted with the characteristic directness of someone who had been doing the job informally for 2 years and was simply relieved to be paid accordingly. The following Thursday, Caleb Brooks came in at 7:30. He took booth 9. He ordered 2 eggs over easy, wheat toast, black coffee, and a side of Bobby's hot sauce. Chloe came to take his order. She stood at the edge of the booth with her notepad, and he looked up at her, and there was a moment between them that had the quality of things that didn't require extensive language. The acknowledgement of a shared experience, the recognition of something that had passed and left a mark. "The usual," he said. She wrote it down. She started to turn, and then she stopped. "I've been thinking about something you did," she said. She said it without preamble, in the direct way she had learned was the only way to say things that mattered. I wanted to say, not just thank you. I wanted to say that you didn't have to make a choice that morning. A lot of people didn't. You did. That means something different than just thank you. Caleb looked at her for a moment with that quality of attention she had come to associate with him, the slightly longer than usual look that extracted more than was immediately visible. You know what I think about when I think about that morning? He said. She shook her head. I think about the people who didn't say anything, not because they were bad people. Most of them were probably decent people who weren't sure what they were supposed to do. He paused. That's the thing that's worth thinking about, not what I did, what it costs people to speak up and why the cost feels so high. Chloe thought about that. She thought about the flush on the back of her neck. She thought about the carafe and her steady hands. She thought about the choice to make her voice level when it would have been much easier and much more honest to make it something else. I think I understand that, she said. I think you do too, he said. You didn't say anything that morning, but you didn't break either. That's its own kind of choice. She went to put in his order. Bobby had it up in 8 minutes. He always had Caleb's order up in 8 minutes, which was faster than the stated time, and which Bobby claimed was coincidence, and which everyone understood was not. She brought it to the table with the coffee and set it down with the particular attentiveness of someone who was paying the kind of attention that went beyond professional competence. Caleb, she said, and it was the first time she had used his name, which they both registered without comment. He looked up. Why do you always take this booth? She asked. The back corner. 6 years. He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. Because from here, he said, you can see everything without anyone being able to see you clearly. You know what's happening in the room before the room knows you're watching. He picked up his fork. It's not about being hidden, he said. It's about being ready. She thought about that for the rest of the shift, the way she thought about things that were too large to process quickly. She thought about it while she refilled coffee and managed the floor and smiled at customers and did the 1,000 small things that the job required. She thought about what it meant to be ready, not for conflict, not for confrontation, but simply for the moment when what you saw required a response and to have decided in advance that you would give one. The jukebox played something old and slow. The November light came through the windows at its flat, directionless angle and caught the chrome surfaces of the counter and broke into small, ordinary glories. Ruth Calloway ate her oatmeal and turned the pages of her newspaper. Bobby called order numbers from the kitchen in his comfortable baritone. Sandra ran the counter with the easy authority of someone who had grown into a role that had always fit her. And in booth 9, Caleb Brooks ate his eggs over easy with the unhurried attention of a man who had nowhere more important to be, which was itself a kind of statement about what mattered and what didn't. Later, much later, Chloe would try to explain to her mother what had changed after that Thursday in November. It was difficult to articulate because the change was not dramatic. Dennis Pruitt was gone. Sandra was promoted. The diner continued to operate as it had always operated, and her life did not transform in any of the ways that stories were supposed to transform lives. What changed was smaller and more durable than that. What changed was that she understood, in a way she had known intellectually but not yet felt in her body, that a room full of people was not a passive thing. It was a collection of choices. Small, quiet, individual choices about what to see and what to acknowledge and what to let pass. And that among those choices, the smallest, quietest ones, sometimes carried the most weight. She had been in that room. She had watched a man stand up from a back booth and walk to a counter and say, in a voice that carried without being raised, that what he had seen was not acceptable. She had watched a room change because one person decided that their presence in it created a responsibility. She had decided in the weeks that followed, that she agreed with that being in a room where something happened made you, in some small and inarguable way, part of what happened, that you could choose the passive part or the active part, but you couldn't choose not to be part of it. It was not a complicated idea. Most important ideas weren't. On a Thursday in December, 5 weeks after everything, Caleb Brooks left his 40% on the table and put on his jacket and walked toward the door. He stopped at the service station where Chloe was stocking napkins. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. He went out. Through the window, she could see him mount the motorcycle parked at the curb, a dark burgundy Harley-Davidson that she had looked up once out of curiosity and that turned out to be a 2018 Street Glide, which meant nothing to her technically, but which she could see even from inside was beautiful in the particular way that well-maintained machines were beautiful, which was to say honestly. He put on his helmet. He started the engine. He pulled out onto Union Avenue and disappeared into the December morning. The diner filled. The coffee needed refilling. Bobby called an order number. Chloe picked up the carafe and went to work.